Hello everyone. Today, Biker Justice Analyst bring you a story full of humanity and compassion. Enjoy listening.
Hell's angel cried at a grave. The woman said, "That's my mother's grave. Who are you?" The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cemetery's peaceful grounds. Hank Callahan's large frame seemed out of place among the delicate flowers and pristine headstones. His leather vest, adorned with patches from his motorcycle club, stood in stark contrast to the serene setting. He knelt before Mary's grave, his weathered hands trembling as they traced the engraved letters of her name. The polished granite reflected his own troubled expression, the deep lines around his eyes, the unkempt beard that couldn't hide the quiver in his jaw. "I'm sorry, Mary," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I should have been here. Should have been here for so many things." Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. A gentle breeze rustled through the nearby maple trees, carrying with it the sweet scent of fresh-cut grass. Hank pulled out an old photograph from his vest pocket, worn and creased from being carried too long. In it, Mary smiled at the camera, her eyes bright with joy. It was taken before everything went wrong, before he'd chosen the road over his family. "I was such a fool," he muttered, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Thought I needed freedom more than anything else. Didn't realize what I had until it was gone." The weight of his choices pressed down on him like a physical force. His broad shoulders hunched forward as tears began to fall freely now. Here, alone among the headstones, he didn't need to maintain the tough exterior he'd worn for so many years. Memory after memory washed over him. Their first date at the local diner, the way Mary's eyes lit up when she laughed, the small apartment they'd shared when they were first married. Each recollection was a fresh wound, a reminder of all he'd thrown away. "The guys at the club," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "they don't know I'm here. Wouldn't understand anyway. The angel, crying at a gravestone." He let out a bitter laugh that caught in his throat. Hank reached out and placed his calloused hand on the cool stone. The reality of Mary's absence hit him again, fresh and raw. A year had passed, but the pain felt as immediate as ever. His chest tightened as he thought about all the years he'd wasted, all the chances he'd missed to make things right. The tears came harder now, and he didn't fight them. His large frame shook with silent sobs as decades of buried emotion poured out. In the safety of the empty cemetery, he allowed himself to be vulnerable, to be the man he'd always hidden behind his tough exterior. "I miss you, Mary," he choked out. "Miss what we could have had, what we should have had." As he knelt there, lost in his grief, he didn't hear the soft footsteps approaching behind him. He was too absorbed in his pain, in the flood of memories and regrets that threatened to drown him. It wasn't until a voice broke through his solitude that he realized he wasn't alone anymore. "Who are you?" Hank quickly wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his jacket and turned toward the voice. A young woman stood there, watching him with careful, uncertain eyes. Hank pushed himself up from the ground, his leather vest creaking as he rose to his full height. At 6'3", he towered over most people, but something about this young woman's steady gaze made him feel smaller somehow. She stood a respectful distance away, her dark hair catching the late afternoon sunlight. His first instinct was to put up his walls, to become the angel that his motorcycle brothers knew. Tough, intimidating, brooking no nonsense. But the tears were still wet on his cheeks, and there was no hiding them. He quickly swiped at his face with a rough hand. "I knew her," he managed, his voice gravelly and uncertain. The young woman took a step closer, and Hank noticed how her eyes, a warm brown, seemed to study his face intently. There was something familiar about those eyes, something that tugged at his memory. "You're wearing club colors," she observed, gesturing to his vest. Her voice was soft but direct. "We weren't friends from before." Hank shifted uncomfortably, his boots crunching on the gravel path. The question hit too close to home, making him acutely aware of the man he'd become since leaving Mary. The patches on his vest felt heavy suddenly, like they were weighing him down. "It's complicated," he replied, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "I knew Mary a long time ago. The young woman's expression changed slightly at his use of Mary's name. She took another step forward, close enough now that Hank could see the slight tremor in her hands as she clutched her purse strap. "You called her Mary," she said quietly. "Most people called her Mrs. Thompson. She took back her maiden name after—" She trailed off, biting her lip. Hank's heart began to pound harder. There was something in the way she spoke, something in the curve of her chin and the set of her shoulders that seemed hauntingly familiar. He found himself studying her features, seeing pieces of Mary in them, but also something else, something of himself. "I'm Michelle," she said, her voice growing stronger. "And this is my mother's grave." The world seemed to tilt slightly under Hank's feet. Michelle. The name echoed in his mind, bringing with it a flood of memories. Mary's voice on the phone years ago, trying to tell him something important, something about a baby. But he'd been too caught up in his new life, too afraid of responsibility to listen. "Michelle," he repeated, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. His hands had started to shake, and he shoved them deep into his jeans pockets. She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "I've been looking for you for a long time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found some old pictures in Mom's things after she passed. Pictures of you and her together." Her eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, Hank saw his own pain reflected there. "You're my father." The words hit him like a physical blow, confirming what his heart had already begun to suspect. Hank stood frozen, the weight of this revelation pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. The tough exterior he'd built over decades cracked a little more as he faced the daughter he never knew he had. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and birds in the nearby trees. Hank's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. His daughter. The word felt strange, impossible. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Mary and we weren't." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Michelle pulled something from her purse, a worn photograph. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it out to him. "This is you and Mom, isn't it? At the county fair." Hank took the photo with unsteady fingers. The image showed a younger version of himself, clean-shaven and smiling, his arm around Mary at the fairgrounds. The Ferris wheel glowed behind them in the twilight. He remembered that night, the smell of cotton candy, Mary's laughter, the way she'd tucked herself against his side when the evening turned cool. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly, still staring at the photo. 25 years, Michelle confirmed. "Mom was already pregnant with me then, but she hadn't told you yet." Hank's head snapped up. "What?" "She tried to tell you," Michelle continued, wrapping her arms around herself. "But you'd already joined the club by then. She said you were different, distant. When she finally worked up the courage to call, you wouldn't listen." The memory hit him like a punch to the gut. That phone call, Mary's voice, urgent and pleading. But he'd been preparing for his first big ride with the club, too caught up in his new life to pay attention. "I never knew," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "She never said. She protected me," Michelle said, a hint of steel entering her voice. "She worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat. Told me you were away on business when I was little. Later, she just stopped talking about you altogether." Hank's legs felt weak. He moved to a nearby bench, sinking down heavily. The leather of his vest creaked as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the photograph still clutched in his hand. "Why now?" he asked, looking up at Michelle. "Why are you telling me this now?" She hesitated, then sat beside him, keeping a careful distance between them. "Mom left me a letter when she died," she explained, pulling an envelope from her purse. It was creased and worn, as if it had been opened and refolded many times. She explained everything, who you were, what happened between you. She included your full name. Michelle's fingers traced the edge of the envelope. "I've been searching for you ever since. It wasn't easy. You changed your name when you joined the club, but I never stopped looking. I needed to know." She paused, swallowing hard. "I needed to know who my father was." Hank stared at the envelope in her hands, his heart pounding. All these years, all the choices he'd made, the life he'd built for himself in the club, none of it had prepared him for this moment. for the daughter he never knew he had, sitting beside him at Mary's grave, holding the truth of his past in her hands. Hank's boots crunched against the gravel path as he stood up from the bench. His head was spinning, and his chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped steel band around it. The photograph in his hand trembled, and he quickly handed it back to Michelle. I need some time, he managed to say, his voice hoarse. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he could muster. Michelle's face fell slightly, but she nodded, taking the photo back. I understand. I know this is a lot to take in. She pulled a small notepad from her purse and wrote something down. Here's my number, if you want to talk. Hank took the paper without looking at it, stuffing it into his jacket pocket. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his normally confident stride unsteady. Behind him, he could feel Michelle's eyes following his retreat, but he couldn't bring himself to look back. He made it to his motorcycle, a sleek black Harley-Davidson that had been his constant companion for years. His hands shook as he grabbed the handlebars, and for a moment, he just stood there, trying to steady his breathing. A daughter. He had a daughter. The revelation echoed in his mind as he kicked the bike to life. The familiar rumble of the engine provided little comfort as he pulled out of the cemetery, muscle memory guiding him through the streets while his thoughts churned. Images of Mary flooded his mind. Her smile, her laugh, the way she used to look at him with such hope in her eyes. How many times had she tried to tell him? How many chances had he missed? The weight of his past choices pressed down on him, heavier than ever before. The city blurred past as he rode. No destination in mind, just the need to move, to escape. But there was no escaping this. 24 years of absence couldn't be erased or explained away. He'd abandoned them both, even if he hadn't known about Michelle at the time. After an hour of aimless riding, Hank found himself in the old industrial district. The streets here were familiar. This was where Ray lived now, in a converted warehouse he'd bought years ago. Ray, the old guard, Jenkins had been there since the beginning, had known Mary, had watched Hank's descent into the club life. If anyone could help him make sense of this, it would be Ray. Hank pulled up outside the warehouse, its brick walls covered in fading murals from the neighborhood's more prosperous days. Ray's custom chopper was parked out front. He still rode, even in his 60s, though not as often as before. Killing the engine, Hank sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Ray had tried to warn him back then, had told him he was throwing away something precious with Mary. Now those words carried a new weight, a new meaning that made Hank's stomach turn. He needed answers. About Mary, about the years he'd missed, about this daughter who'd suddenly appeared in his life. Ray had stayed in touch with people from the old neighborhood. Maybe he knew something, anything that could help Hank understand what had happened after he'd left. Taking a deep breath, Hank dismounted his bike and walked toward the warehouse's side door. The metal steps clanged under his boots as he climbed to the second floor, where Ray kept his living space. Each step felt heavy, like he was walking toward a reckoning he'd been avoiding for far too long. The fluorescent lights of Jerry's diner buzzed overhead as Hank slid into the worn red vinyl booth across from Ray. The place hadn't changed in 20 years. Same checkered floor, same coffee-stained counter, same tired waitresses shuffling between tables. Ray looked older than Hank remembered, his gray hair thinner, but his eyes still held that same sharp intelligence. He stirred his coffee slowly, the spoon clinking against a ceramic mug. "So, you finally met her," Ray said, his voice quiet but firm. It wasn't a question. Hank's shoulders tensed. "You knew about Michelle?" "Course I did." Ray took a sip of his coffee. "Mary and I kept in touch over the years. Someone had to look out for them after you left." The words hit Hank like a physical blow. He stared down at his untouched coffee, watching the steam rise in lazy spirals. The waitress approached their table, but Ray waved her away with a subtle gesture. "Mary never talked about you much after you left," Ray continued, his weathered hands wrapped around his mug. "But anyone could see she still loved you. It was in the little things, the way she'd pause sometimes, looking at old photographs when she thought no one was watching. How she never took off that silver ring you gave her." Hank's throat tightened. He remembered that ring, a simple band with a Celtic knot pattern. He'd given it to her on their first anniversary, back when they were young and everything seemed possible. She kept your old leather jacket too, Ray said, his voice softening. Hung in the back of her closet. Michelle found it when she was 12, started asking questions. That's when Mary had to tell her something about you. What did she say? Hank's voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. Told her you were away working. Kept it vague. Mary wasn't one to speak ill of anyone, especially not to her daughter. Ray leaned back, studying Hank's face. She protected your image, Hank, even after everything. The diner's sounds faded into the background. The clink of plates, the murmur of conversations, the hiss of the grill, as Hank absorbed Ray's words. The weight of Mary's silence, her protection, her love, it all pressed down on him like a physical thing. There were times, Ray continued, when Mary would see something on the news about the club, about you. She'd get this look in her eyes, like she was about to reach out. But then she'd remember the hard times, the fights, the drinking. The pain would come back, and she'd close up again. Hank remembered those times too. The arguments that shook the walls, the promises he'd broken, the trust he'd shattered. But he'd never known about Michelle. The thought of his daughter growing up without him, while Mary carried that burden alone, made him feel sick. She always believed you'd come back someday, Ray said, his voice gentle but firm. Even near the end, she held on to that hope. But there was too much hurt, too many old wounds. She couldn't bring herself to reach out, and maybe she was protecting Michelle too, waiting for you to be ready, to be the man she knew you could be. The truth of it settled over Hank like a heavy blanket. Mary had loved him enough to keep his memory alive for their daughter, but had loved Michelle enough to protect her from his chaos until he was ready to be a father. The realization both warmed and burned him, like a shot of whiskey on a cold night. Hank's motorcycle rumbled to a stop in front of Michelle's modest two-story house. The white paint was peeling slightly, and the small garden needed attention, but there was something warm about it, something that reminded him of Mary. He sat there for a moment, gathering his courage, before walking up the concrete path to the front door. Michelle opened it before he could knock. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, wearing jeans and a simple blue sweater. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and her expression was guarded. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. The living room was neat but lived in, with a worn couch and photographs on the walls. Hank's eyes caught on one of Mary holding a young Michelle at what looked like a school event. His chest tightened. "I talked to Ray," Hank said, his voice rougher than he intended. "He told me about how things were." Michelle sat on the couch, tucking her feet under her. "Mom's friend Ray? The mechanic?" "Yeah." Hank remained standing, feeling too big and awkward for the cozy space. "He kept in touch with your mom over the years." "I remember him," Michelle said softly. "He used to fix Mom's car when it broke down. Never charged her full price." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Hank shifted his weight, his leather jacket creaking. "Look," Michelle finally said, "I've spent years wondering about you, making up stories in my head about why you weren't around. Mom never said anything bad about you, but..." She paused, picking a loose thread on the couch. "But your absence spoke louder than any words could." Hank felt each word like a physical blow. "I didn't know about you," he said. "If I had, would it have made a difference?" Michelle's voice was quiet but sharp. "From what little I've learned, you were pretty deep into the biker life. Would knowing about me have changed anything?" The honest question deserved an honest answer. "I don't know," Hank admitted. "I was a different person back then. Angry. Selfish." He ran a hand through his beard. "I'm not proud of who I was." Michelle's eyes studied his face, searching for something. "And now? Who are you now?" "Someone who'd like a chance to know his daughter," Hank said. "If she's willing." Michelle's expression softened slightly, but the wariness remained. "It's not that simple. You can't just walk into my life after 24 years and expect." "I know," Hank interrupted gently. "I know it's not simple, but maybe we could start small." He hesitated, then pressed on. "Would you let me take you to dinner? Just to talk, get to know each other a little." Michelle's fingers twisted in her lap. The afternoon light, filtering through the windows, caught the uncertainty in her eyes. She looked so much like Mary in that moment, the same thoughtful pause before making a decision. She started, then stopped. Her shoulders tensed slightly. I need to think about it. This is all happening so fast, and I'm not sure. She trailed off, looking away. The evening sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Michelle pulled into the parking lot of Joey's family restaurant. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tight, her stomach doing nervous flips. After tossing and turning all night, she'd finally called Hank that morning, agreeing to dinner. The restaurant was a local favorite. Nothing fancy, just honest food and warm lighting. Through the window, she could see Hank already seated in a corner booth. His massive frame looked almost comical in the cozy setting, his leather vest standing out among the cheerful checked tablecloths. Taking a deep breath, Michelle walked in. The familiar smell of home, cooking, and coffee wrapped around her like a warm blanket. Hank stood up as she approached, awkwardly waiting for her to sit before settling back down. "Thanks for coming," he said, his gruff voice softer than usual. "I wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I," Michelle admitted, fidgeting with her napkin. "But I figure we have to start somewhere." A waitress came by with menus and water, her cheerful chatter filling the uncomfortable silence. After she left, they both stared at their menus, neither quite ready to begin the conversation they needed to have. "Your mom used to love this place," Hank said suddenly, setting his menu down. "She always ordered the chicken pot pie." Michelle's throat tightened. "Yeah, she did. We came here every Friday night when I was little." She paused, then added, she said it reminded her of her grandmother's cooking. "Sarah's cooking," Hank nodded. "Mary talked about it all the time when we were young." His eyes grew distant. "Those were good days before I—" He trailed off, his weathered hands clasping together on the table. The waitress returned for their orders. Michelle got the chicken pot pie, just like her mom used to. Hank ordered a burger, his voice rough with emotion. "I made a lot of mistakes," Hank continued after the waitress left. "The biggest one was leaving your mother. The bike gang. It seemed like freedom at the time, like I was finally part of something bigger than myself." He shook his head, "But all I did was run away from the best thing in my life." Michelle watched him, seeing the pain etched in the lines of his face. "Why didn't you ever come back?" "Shame, mostly," he admitted. "The longer I stayed away, the harder it got to face what I'd done. Then pride got mixed in there too. Stupid, stubborn pride." He took a shaky breath. "When I heard about your mom's passing, it hit me hard. All those years wasted, all those chances I threw away." Their food arrived, steaming and fragrant. Michelle took a bite of her pot pie, the familiar taste bringing tears to her eyes. It tasted just like she remembered. "She never stopped loving you," Michelle said quietly. "Even after everything. She kept your old leather jacket in her closet until the day she died." Hank's hands trembled slightly as he set down his burger. "I didn't deserve that kind of love," he said, his voice thick. "I was a coward, Michelle. A damn coward who ran when things got tough." He looked up at her, his eyes wet. "And I missed everything. Your first steps, your first day of school, your graduation. I missed it all." Michelle felt her own defenses starting to crack. The big, tough biker sitting across from her wasn't the monster she'd sometimes imagined in her darker moments. He was just a man, a flawed, regretful man who'd made terrible choices and was now facing their consequences. The late afternoon sun streamed through Michelle's kitchen window, casting warm patches of light across her small dining table. She and Hank sat across from each other, two steaming mugs of coffee between them. It had become their routine over the past few weeks, these quiet afternoon talks in her cozy home. "So that's when I decided to join the swim team," Michelle said, tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "Mom worked 2 jobs to pay for the lessons and equipment. I remember feeling so guilty about asking her for a new swimsuit when my old one got too small." Hank's weathered hands tightened around his mug. "She shouldn't have had to do it alone." "No, she shouldn't have." Michelle's voice was quiet but firm. "Do you know what it's like being the only kid at the father-daughter dance with your uncle? Or making Father's Day cards in school and having no one to give them to?" Hank's face crumpled with shame. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been." "The other kids used to make up stories about you," Michelle continued, her voice thick with old pain. "They'd say you were a secret agent, or an astronaut, or something exciting. But Mom never said anything. She'd just get this sad look in her eyes whenever I asked about you. Hank pushed his coffee aside, his shoulders hunched. I was none of those things, just a coward running from responsibility. I used to sit by the window on my birthday, Michelle said, tears gathering in her eyes. Every year, I'd wait, thinking maybe this would be the year you'd show up. Mom would make my favorite cake, but I couldn't enjoy it because I kept watching the street. The silence between them grew heavy with unspoken grief. Outside, a bird chirped cheerfully, oblivious to the weight of memories being shared inside. I stopped waiting eventually. Michelle wiped her eyes. It was easier to pretend you didn't exist than to keep hoping. Mom never dated anyone else, you know? She always said her heart belonged to you, even after everything. Hank's voice was rough with emotion. Your mother was the best person I ever knew, and I threw it all away because I was scared of being tied down. He reached across the table, hesitating before gently placing his hand over Michelle's. I know I can't make up for all those years, but I swear to you, Michelle, I'm not going anywhere this time. Michelle looked at his hand covering hers, strong, calloused, marked with faded tattoos. The hand of a man who'd lived a hard life, but was trying to do better. I've heard promises before, she said softly. From boyfriends, friends, people who said they'd always be there. But they all left eventually. I'm not asking you to trust me right away, Hank said. I know I haven't earned that. But I'm your father, and I'm going to stay right here, proving myself to you every day for as long as it takes. Michelle studied his face, the earnest look in his eyes, the trembling in his beard as he fought to control his emotions. After a long moment, she gave his hand a small squeeze. Okay, she whispered. We can try. The relief that flooded Hank's face was almost painful to watch. He squeezed her hand back, gentle despite his strength, as if afraid she might break or disappear if he held on too tight. Michelle stood in front of her mirror, fidgeting with her denim jacket. The invitation to the motorcycle club's barbecue had caught her off guard. She'd known about Hank's connection to the biker world, but seeing it up close felt like stepping into unknown territory. Her phone buzzed. A text from Hank. I'm outside when you're ready. Taking a deep breath, Michelle grabbed her purse and headed out. Hank sat astride his gleaming Harley, looking every bit the intimidating biker in his leather vest covered with patches. But his face softened when he saw her, and he gave her a gentle smile. You look nice, he said, handing her a helmet. You sure you're okay riding with me? Michelle took the helmet, turning it in her hands. I've never been on a motorcycle before. Just hold on tight and lean when I lean. It's only 15 minutes to the clubhouse. His voice was reassuring, but Michelle could sense his nervousness too. This mattered to him. The ride was both terrifying and exhilarating. Michelle found herself relaxing as they cruised through town, the wind whipping at her jacket. She could almost understand why Hank loved this so much. The clubhouse turned out to be a converted warehouse with rows of motorcycles parked outside. Music and laughter spilled from the open doors, along with the smell of barbecue. As they pulled up, several rough-looking men in leather vests similar to Hank's turned to watch. Michelle's stomach tightened. These men, with their tattoos and weathered faces, seemed to belong to a different world entirely. A world she wasn't sure she wanted to be part of. You okay? Hank asked as he helped her off the bike. Yeah, she lied, her voice barely audible over the music. They walked toward the entrance, and Michelle felt every eye on them. A huge man with a gray beard stepped forward, his arms covered in faded tattoos. So, this is her? He asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Ray, Hank nodded. This is Michelle. Michelle, this is Ray, my oldest friend. Ray's face broke into a warm smile. Been waiting to meet you, sweetheart. Your dad here hasn't shut up about you for weeks. Michelle managed a small smile, but her discomfort must have shown. More bikers were gathering around, their curious faces making her feel like an exhibit at a zoo. Some were kind-looking, others more intimidating, but all of them seemed to be studying her intently. Look at those eyes, one woman said. Just like Mary's. She's got your height, Hank, another man called out. The attention was overwhelming. Michelle felt her chest tighten, her breaths coming faster. She took a small step backward, bumping into Hank. Hank must have sensed her distress because he placed a protective hand on her shoulder. Hey, he said softly, turning her away from the crowd. We can leave if you want. No pressure. Michelle looked up at him, seeing the concern in his eyes. It's just they're all staring at me. Because they're happy for me, Hank explained. These people, they've seen me at my worst. They know how much I regret losing you and your mom. Having you here, his voice caught. It means everything to me. But if it's too much, we'll go. The sincerity in his voice touched something in Michelle's heart. She looked around again at the gathering. Ray was shooing people away, giving them space. The woman who'd mentioned her eyes was now busy at the grill, pretending not to watch them. They were rough around the edges, yes, but they clearly cared about Hank. Maybe we could stay for a little while, Michelle said softly. The law office of Patterson and Associates felt too small for Hank's large frame. He shifted uncomfortably in the leather chair, while Michelle sat perfectly still beside him. The air conditioning hummed quietly as Mr. Patterson, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, spread several documents across his mahogany desk. I apologize for calling you both in on such short notice, the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses. But there's been a development regarding Mary's estate that requires immediate attention. Michelle leaned forward. What kind of development? Your mother left behind more than just the house, Mr. Patterson explained. There's a substantial inheritance, primarily from investments she made over the years and a life insurance policy that matured upon her passing. Hank's weathered hands gripped the armrests. Mary never mentioned anything about investments. She was very private about her finances, the lawyer continued. The total sum amounts to just over $300,000. Michelle's eyes widened. That's impossible. Mom could barely make ends meet. Your mother was quite resourceful, Mr. Patterson said, shuffling through more papers. She worked multiple jobs, saved everything she could, and made some surprisingly good investment choices. However, he paused, removing his glasses. There's a complication. Hank felt his stomach tighten. He learned long ago that complications usually meant trouble. A man named James Morton has filed a claim against the estate. He claims to have documentation proving that a portion of these investments were made with his money he allegedly loaned to Mary years ago. That's ridiculous, Michelle snapped. Mom never mentioned anyone named James Morton. Mr. Patterson pulled out another document. According to his claim, these transactions occurred shortly after your father left. He glanced at Hank apologetically. Mr. Morton claims he helped Mary through some difficult financial times. Hank's face darkened. The thought of Mary struggling, having to borrow money because he wasn't there to help, made his chest ache with guilt. How much is he claiming? Michelle asked, her voice tight. He's asserting rights to roughly half of the estate. Half. Hank stood up suddenly, making the lawyer flinch. This is robbery. Mary would have told someone if she owed that kind of money. Michelle touched her father's arm. Dad, please sit down. The word dad caught Hank off guard. It was the first time she'd called him that. He sank back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. What are our options? Michelle asked the lawyer. We can fight it, of course. But Mr. Morton has provided some compelling documentation. Old checks, letters, even photographs with your mother. Hank's fists clenched. Photographs. From the time period in question, Mr. Patterson confirmed. They appear to show a close friendship. Michelle stood up abruptly, walking to the window. Her reflection in the glass showed tears threatening to spill. So while you were gone, she said to Hank, her voice trembling, Mom had to turn to this man for help. And now he's trying to take what she left for me. Michelle, Hank started. Don't. She turned back, wiping her eyes. Just don't. Mr. Patterson, what's our next step? The lawyer outlined the legal process ahead, but Hank barely heard the words. He watched his daughter's rigid posture, saw the wall building between them again. Just when they'd started to connect, his past mistakes were creating new wounds. Mr. Patterson gathered his papers. I'll need you both to review these documents. We should file our response within the week. Michelle nodded, avoiding Hank's gaze. I'll take them home to read. The silence that followed was deafening. All the progress they'd made, all the careful steps toward trust, now seemed to be crumbling under the weight of this new revelation. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through Mr. Patterson's office windows as Hank sat alone with the lawyer. His leather jacket creaked against the chair as he leaned forward, studying the documents spread across the desk. "There's something else you should know, Mr. Callahan," Patterson said, pulling out a thick manila folder. "These are Mary's financial records from the past 20 years. Hank's throat tightened as he looked at the stack of papers. "Why didn't you show these earlier? I wanted to speak with you privately first." Patterson opened the folder, revealing columns of numbers and bank statements. "Mary faced significant financial hardships after you left. She took out multiple loans, maxed out credit cards, and even borrowed against her life insurance policy." The words hit Hank like physical blows. He ran a hand through his beard, trying to maintain his composure. How bad was it? At its worst, she was nearly $100,000 in debt. Patterson adjusted his glasses. She worked 3 jobs at one point: her regular nursing shift, weekend waitressing, and bookkeeping for a local business. Hank stood up abruptly, pacing the office. The thought of Mary exhausting herself, struggling alone while he was off with his motorcycle gang, made him sick to his stomach. "Why didn't she reach out to me?" "According to these notes," Patterson said, lifting another document, "she tried. Several times. The letters came back unopened." Shame burned through Hank's chest. He remembered those letters, remembered tossing them aside without reading them, too caught up in his own selfish freedom. "And this Morton character?" Hank asked, his voice rough. "What's his real connection to all this?" Patterson hesitated. The documentation suggests he helped Mary refinance some of her debts. But something about his claim doesn't add up. The timing of these supposed loans doesn't match Mary's financial records. Hank nodded slowly, his jaw set. He needed to talk to Michelle. He found her at her small apartment across town. When she opened the door, her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but her expression was guarded. "I know about the debts," Hank said without preamble. Michelle's shoulders sagged. She stepped aside, letting him in. The apartment was modest but neat, with photos of Mary on nearly every wall. They sat at her small kitchen table, a pot of coffee between them. "Mom never wanted you to know," Michelle said, wrapping her hand around her coffee mug. "She was too proud. Tell me everything," Hank said quietly. Michelle took a deep breath. "After you left, things got really hard. Mom's nursing salary wasn't enough to cover everything. The mortgage, my school expenses, medical bills. She started borrowing money, taking extra shifts, anything to keep us afloat." Hank's hands clenched into fists under the table. "And Morton, he was Mom's supervisor at the hospital," Michelle explained. "He offered to help with some of the debt, but..." She paused, fighting back tears. "Mom always said something felt wrong about him. She refused his help, took out more legitimate loans instead. Now he's claiming those loans were from him personally. Why didn't your mother tell me any of this?" Hank's voice cracked. Michelle looked at him directly, her eyes filled with years of pain. "She tried, Dad. She wrote to you for months, but you never answered. Eventually, she stopped trying. The silence that followed was heavy with 2 decades of regret and unspoken words." Hank stared at his reflection in the dark coffee, seeing for the first time the full impact of his abandonment. Hank stood in the parking lot of Ray's auto shop, his boots crunching on loose gravel. The afternoon sun beat down on his leather jacket as he watched a sleek black Mercedes pull up. The car looked out of place among the rusty pickup trucks and beat-up motorcycles. Tony the Snake Mancini stepped out, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his smile was as fake as ever. 20 years hadn't changed that snake-like quality about him. Well, Tony said, spreading his arms wide. "If it isn't Hank, the angel Callahan himself." His voice dripped with mock friendliness. Hank crossed his arms, his jaw tight. "Cut the act, Tony. What's your game with Mary's will?" Tony adjusted his silk tie, that practiced smile never wavering. "Game? I'm hurt, old friend. I'm simply collecting on some debts that Mary owed me. Nothing personal." "You're lying," Hank growled. "Mary never borrowed money from you. I've seen the records. Records can be incomplete." Tony walked closer, his expensive shoes raising little dust clouds. "Look, Hank, we both know how this works. Your daughter, stands to inherit quite a sum. All I'm asking for is my fair share. Hank's fists clenched at the mention of Michelle. Stay away from my daughter. Your daughter? Tony laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. That's rich, coming from the man who abandoned her. How long did it take you to even know she existed? 20 years. The word stung, but Hank held his ground. I might have failed her before, but I'm here now, and I'm not letting you anywhere near her or Mary's money. Tony's friendly facade cracked slightly, his eyes turning cold. You don't want to make an enemy of me, Hank. I'm not the same person who used to ride with you. I've got friends in high places now. And I'm not the same man who left his family. Hank stepped closer, using his height advantage to look down at Tony. I don't care about your friends or your fancy suit. You try to hurt Michelle, and you'll answer to me. Is that a threat? Tony's hand twitched toward his pocket. It's a promise. Hank's voice was low and dangerous. I've got the documentation proving Mary's real debts. I've got witnesses who'll testify about her financial situation. And I've got enough dirt on you from the old days to bury you 10 times over. Tony's smile finally disappeared completely. You wouldn't dare. Those old stories would hurt you as much as me. The difference is, Hank said, I don't care about protecting my reputation anymore. All I care about is protecting my daughter. They stood there in tense silence, the hot sun beating down on them. Tony was the first to look away, adjusting his cuffs with slightly trembling hands. This isn't over, Hank, Tony said, backing toward his car. You're making a big mistake. The only mistake I made was not being there for my family, Hank replied. I won't make that mistake again. Tony got back into his Mercedes, the engine purring to life. As he pulled away, he rolled down his window. Give my regards to Michelle. I'm sure we'll be seeing each other soon. Hank watched the car disappear around the corner, his heart pounding with anger and determination. He pulled out his phone to call Michelle. They needed to prepare for whatever Tony might try next. Michelle watched her father from across his small kitchen table. His hands trembled as he shuffled through a stack of legal papers, his knuckles white against the edges. Dark circles had formed under his eyes, and his usually neat beard looked unkempt. Dad, she said softly, maybe we should take a break. You've been at this for hours. Hank slammed his palm against the table, making the coffee cups rattle. We don't have time for breaks. Tony's lawyers are breathing down our necks. Michelle flinched at his outburst, but held her ground. The hearing isn't for another 2 weeks. Working yourself into exhaustion won't help anyone. You don't understand, he growled, shoving the papers away. Tony's not just some businessman with lawyers. He's dangerous. Back in the day, Hank stopped himself, running a hand through his graying hair. Back in the day, what? Michelle pressed. You keep hinting at these dark secrets, but you never tell me the whole story. How am I supposed to help if you won't let me in? Hank stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. He paced the small kitchen, his heavy boots thudding with each step. Trust me, there are things you're better off not knowing. I'm not a child anymore, Michelle said, her voice rising. I've spent 24 years not knowing anything about you. Don't you think I deserve the truth now? The truth. Hank whirled around, his face flushed. You want the truth? The truth is that your mother and I weren't just some couple that drifted apart. I was involved in things, dangerous things. The kind of things that would have put you both at risk. Michelle stood up too, facing him. And now? What about now? Because all I see is you shutting me out again, making decisions about my life without including me. I'm trying to protect you. Hank's voice boomed through the small space. His fist connected with the wall, making Michelle jump. Every time I look at you, I see Mary. I see everything I failed to protect. And now Tony's back, threatening everything, and I can't. I just can't. Can't what? Michelle demanded, tears forming in her eyes. Can't trust me? Can't let me help? Or can't handle being a father? You don't understand the weight of this. Hank roared. You sit there in your nice, clean life, judging me, but you have no idea what it's like carrying the things I've done, the people I've hurt, the lives I've ruined. You're right, Michelle said, her voice suddenly quiet. I don't understand. Because you won't let me. She grabbed her purse from the counter, wiping her eyes. And maybe that's the real problem. You're so caught up in your past that you can't see what's right in front of you. Michelle, Hank's anger deflated slightly, but it was too late. "I need some space," she said, heading for the door. "Call me when you're ready to treat me like an adult instead of some obligation you need to protect." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Hank alone in his kitchen. Through the window, he watched her get into her car and drive away, the tail lights disappearing into the gathering dusk. The silence that followed was deafening. Hank stood in his kitchen, staring at the dent he'd made in the wall. His hand throbbed, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the ache in his chest. The coffee in his cup had gone cold, untouched since Michelle left. "What am I doing?" he muttered, sinking heavily into his chair. The scattered legal papers reminded him of the mess he'd made of everything. He picked up a photo that had fallen from between the documents, an old picture of Mary holding baby Michelle. His thick fingers traced the edge of the photograph, remembering the day it was taken. Through his window, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across his kitchen table. The light caught the tattoos on his arms, faded reminders of a life he'd chosen over his family. Each inked symbol told a story of rebellion, of running away, of choosing the easy path instead of staying to face his responsibilities. "I'm still running," he said to the empty room. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. Even now, with Michelle back in his life, he was pushing her away instead of letting her in. He was hiding behind the excuse of protection, but really, he was protecting himself from having to face his own shame. Ray's words from their last conversation echoed in his mind. "You can't protect someone by keeping them in the dark, Hank. That ain't protection. That's control." Hank got up and paced his small living room, his boots heavy on the worn carpet. The walls were bare except for a few motorcycle posters and his old club jacket hanging by the door. The leather was cracked with age, the patches faded, just like him, worn down by years of trying to be something he wasn't. He caught his reflection in the window and barely recognized himself. The tough exterior he'd built over the years felt like a costume now, a shield he'd hidden behind for so long he'd forgotten who he really was. But Michelle had seen through it, just like Mary always had. "I can't lose her again," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. The thought of Michelle walking away for good, just as he'd walked away from Mary all those years ago, made his chest tighten with panic. Hank walked to his bedroom and opened the small safe in his closet. Inside lay Mary's last letter to him, the one the lawyer had given him. He hadn't been able to read it yet, too afraid of what it might say. But now, holding it in his trembling hands, he knew it was time. "Dear Hank," the letter began in Mary's familiar handwriting. "If you're reading this, it means you found your way back to Michelle. She's so much like you, strong, stubborn, and carrying a heart bigger than she lets anyone see. Don't make the same mistake twice. Don't let fear keep you from being the father she needs." Tears blurred his vision, and he had to stop reading. Mary had known him better than he knew himself. She'd seen past his tough exterior to the scared man underneath, the one who ran from love because he didn't think he deserved it. Hank folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. He grabbed his keys from the counter, determination replacing the uncertainty in his eyes. It was time to stop running. Time to show Michelle that he could be more than his past, more than his mistakes. He shrugged on his jacket and headed for the door. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Somewhere out there, Michelle was hurting because of him, and this time, he wouldn't let her face that pain alone. The evening light cast long shadows across Michelle's apartment complex as Hank pulled into the parking lot. His motorcycle's rumble echoed off the brick walls before he cut the engine. For a moment, he sat there, Mary's letter heavy in his pocket, gathering his courage. The walk to her door felt like the longest journey of his life. Each step brought back memories of times he should have been there for her, but wasn't. Birthday parties missed. School graduations unattended. A whole life he'd chosen to skip. Hank knocked on the door, his knuckles barely touching the wood. When no answer came, he tried again, louder this time. "Michelle, it's me. Please, I need to talk to you." He heard movement inside, then silence. The door opened just enough for him to see Michelle's face. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she looked tired. "What do you want, Hank?" The use of his name instead of Dad stung, but he deserved it. "Can I come in?" Just for a few minutes. Michelle hesitated, then opened the door wider. Her apartment was small but neat, with photos on the walls, memories of a life he hadn't been part of. She crossed her arms and leaned against the kitchen counter, waiting. "I'm sorry," Hank began, his voice rough. "I've been pushing you away because—" He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily. "Because I'm scared." Michelle's eyebrows rose slightly, but she remained silent. "I've spent my whole life running from things that matter. From responsibility. From love." Hank pulled Mary's letter from his pocket, but didn't unfold it. "Your mother knew me better than I knew myself. She knew I'd mess this up because that's what I do. I push people away before they can leave me. Like you left us." Michelle's voice was quiet but sharp. "Yeah." Hank's shoulders slumped. "Exactly like that. I convinced myself I was protecting you both by staying away. But the truth is I was protecting myself. I was a coward." Michelle moved to sit on her couch, some of the tension leaving her body. "You're still doing it, you know? Keeping secrets. Trying to handle everything yourself." "I know." Hank remained standing, his large frame making the room feel smaller. "I'm not good at this, at being open, at being vulnerable. But I want to learn. I want to be better. Why now? Because I finally understand what I lost." Hank's voice cracked. "Not just your mother, but you. All those years I could have watched you grow up. All the times I could have been there for you. I can't get those back, but I don't want to lose any more time." Michelle wiped at her eyes. "I can't just forget everything and trust you completely. It doesn't work that way. I know that." Hank took a tentative step forward. "I'm not asking you to. I'm just asking for a chance to prove that I can change. To show you who I really am, not who I've been pretending to be." After what felt like an eternity, Michelle nodded slowly. "Okay, but no more secrets. No more pushing me away when things get tough. I promise." The words came out stronger than Hank expected, filled with a determination he hadn't felt in years. "We'll see," Michelle said, but there was a hint of warmth in her voice. "I'm not ready to just pick up where we left off, but I'm willing to try." For Hank, it was enough. It was more than he deserved, and he knew it. That's all I'm asking for. The early morning sun filtered through the windows of the local diner as Hank and Michelle sat across from each other in a worn leather booth. Steam rose from their coffee cups while Michelle stirred cream into hers, something Hank noticed she did just like her mother used to. "So you really never learned to cook?" Michelle asked, a small smile playing at her lips. Hank shook his head, his beard hiding what might have been embarrassment. "Never had much reason to. Diners and takeout were always easier." "Mom was an amazing cook," Michelle said, her eyes distant with memory. "She could make something out of nothing, you know, even when things were tight." The weight of those words hung between them, but Hank didn't shy away from it like he might have before. "Tell me more about that. About what she was like when you were growing up." As Michelle shared stories about Mary, Hank listened intently, soaking in every detail. They finished their breakfast and decided to walk through the nearby shopping district, something that would have felt impossible just weeks ago. Michelle stopped at a bookstore window, pointing at a display. "Mom used to read to me every night when I was little. Even after I could read on my own, she'd still sometimes sit on my bed and we'd take turns reading chapters." Hank watched his daughter's face light up at the memory, and it gave him courage. "Would you want to go in? Maybe find something we could both read." Michelle looked surprised but nodded. They spent an hour browsing together, eventually settling on a mystery novel they both thought sounded interesting. It wasn't much, but it was something they could share. Later that week, they met at a grocery store. Michelle had offered to teach Hank some basic cooking skills, and he'd agreed, though his kitchen barely had the necessary equipment. As they walked the aisles, Michelle explained different ingredients and possible meals, while Hank pushed the cart and asked questions that might have seemed obvious to others. "These are the pasta shapes Mom always used for her casserole," Michelle said, holding up a box. Her voice caught slightly at the memory. Instead of changing the subject like he once would have, Hank asked softly, "Would you want to try making it together?" Michelle nodded, and they added the pasta to their cart. Their cooking lesson that evening was a disaster, smoke alarm and all, but they ended up laughing about it over delivered pizza. The burnt casserole sat in Hank's sink, a reminder that not everything had to be perfect to be worthwhile. The next few weeks followed a similar pattern. Small moments, shared stories, careful steps forward. They went to a movie together, walked in the park where Michelle used to play as a child, and even spent one afternoon where Michelle helped Hank organize his cluttered garage. One Tuesday evening, Hank arrived at Michelle's apartment for their weekly dinner. He carried a worn cardboard box, handling it like it contained something precious. Michelle let him in, curious about what he was holding. "I've been going through some things," Hank said, setting the box on her coffee table. "Found this at the back of my closet. Mary gave it to me years ago, but He trailed off, then opened the box carefully. Inside was a leather-bound photo album, its corners softened with age. Michelle's breath caught as Hank lifted it out and handed it to her. Opening it, she found page after page of photographs. Her mother young and smiling, holding a baby Michelle, birthday parties, first days of school, quiet moments at home that she hadn't even known were captured on film. "Mom kept all of these," Michelle whispered, her fingers trailing over the protective plastic sheets. The law office of Harrison and Associates loomed before them, its glass and steel facade reflecting the morning sun. Hank adjusted his leather jacket, uncomfortable in the corporate setting. Michelle stood beside him, clutching a folder of documents they'd gathered over the past weeks. "You ready?" Hank asked, his voice gruff but gentle. Michelle nodded, squaring her shoulders. "As I'll ever be." They rode the elevator in silence to the 10th floor. The leather chairs in the waiting room were too soft, making Hank feel even more out of place. His weathered boots stood out against the polished marble floor. When they entered the conference room, Tony, the snake, Mancini was already there, wearing an expensive suit and a smug smile. The sight of him made Hank's jaw clench. Their lawyer, Mr. Peterson, sat at one end of the long table, while Tony's representative occupied the other. "Mr. Callahan, Ms. Callahan, please have a seat," Mr. Peterson said, gesturing to the chairs across from Tony. Michelle's hands trembled slightly as she arranged her documents. Hank placed his larger hand over hers for a moment, steadying them both. "We're here to resolve the matter of Mary Callahan's estate," Mr. Peterson began, his voice steady and professional. "Mr. Mancini has presented documentation suggesting that Mrs. Callahan owed him a substantial sum of money, which he claims should be paid from the estate before any inheritance is distributed." Tony leaned forward, his smile never wavering. "I was merely trying to help an old friend in need. Mary borrowed money from me, and I have the paperwork to prove it." "Those documents are forged," Hank growled, his fingers gripping the armrests of his chair. Mr. Peterson held up a hand. "We've had experts examine the documentation from both parties." He pulled out a thick folder. "What we found is quite interesting." The tension in the room grew as the lawyer began reviewing the findings. Michelle sat straight-backed, her eyes never leaving Tony's face. Hank noticed how the other man's confident smile began to slip as Mr. Peterson continued. "The dates on Mr. Mancini's documents don't align with Mrs. Callahan's known whereabouts," the lawyer explained. "Furthermore, we have evidence that Mrs. Callahan was actually out of state during the time these loans were supposedly made." Tony's lawyer shuffled through his papers, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "My client maintains that." "Your client," Hank interrupted, his voice low and dangerous, "is a liar who's trying to steal from my daughter." Mr. Peterson nodded, pulling out another document. "We also have testimony from Mrs. Callahan's bank manager confirming that she never received the amounts Mr. Mancini claims to have lent her." The color drained from Tony's face as the lawyer continued presenting evidence that systematically dismantled his claim. Michelle reached for Hank's hand under the table, squeezing it tightly. "Given these findings," Mr. Peterson concluded, "and the overwhelming evidence that Mrs. Callahan's will is legitimate and unencumbered by any valid claims, I'm prepared to dismiss Mr. Mancini's contest of the will." He turned to Michelle. "Ms. Callahan, you are the sole heir to your mother's estate, as originally stated in her will." Tony stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His lawyer gathered their papers quickly, knowing their case had crumbled. "This isn't over," Tony muttered as he headed for the door. "Yes, it is," Hank said firmly, not even bothering to turn around. "It's exactly over." Mr. Peterson smiled at Michelle. The estate will be transferred to your name immediately. Your mother's wishes will be honored as she intended. The sun was setting when Hank's phone buzzed in his pocket. He was sitting on his front porch, nursing a cold soda and watching the neighborhood kids play street hockey. The caller ID showed Ray's name, and a smile tugged at his weathered face. "Hey, old-timer," Hank answered, his voice lighter than it had been in weeks. "Word travels fast." Ray chuckled on the other end. "Heard you put Tony in his place today. About time someone knocked that snake down a peg or two." Hank took a long sip of his drink, letting the carbonation fizz on his tongue. Yeah, well, he had it coming. Trying to steal from Michelle. His grip tightened on the can. That was low, even for him. Speaking of Michelle, Ray's voice softened. "How's she holding up? Better now that this mess is over." Hank leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "She's at home, going through some of Mary's old papers. Said she needed some time alone to process everything. Can't blame her. It's been quite a journey for both of you." There was a pause, and Hank could hear Ray shifting in his seat. "You know, Hank, I gotta say something." "What's that?" "I'm proud of you, brother. Real proud." Ray's words carried the weight of their decades-long friendship. "Watching you these past few months, the way you've changed. Mary will be proud too." Hank's throat tightened. He watched as one of the kids scored a goal, their victory shout echoing down the street. "I'm not the same man I was, Ray. Can't be that guy anymore." "That's exactly what I mean," Ray said. The old Hank would have handled Tony differently. Probably would have ended with broken bones and police reports. A laugh rumbled in Hank's chest. "The thought crossed my mind. But you didn't. You did it the right way, the legal way. You protected your daughter without compromising who you're trying to become." Ray cleared his throat. "That takes real strength, brother. More strength than throwing punches ever did." Hank stood up, walking to the porch railing. The streetlights were starting to flicker on, casting long shadows across the pavement. "Couldn't have done it without you, Ray. You've been there since the beginning, keeping me straight." "That's what real friends do," Ray replied. "Not the ones who drag you down or try to keep you in the past. The ones who see the best in you, even when you can't see it yourself." Hank thought about Tony, about all the others from his old life who tried to pull him back into the darkness. Then he thought about Ray, who'd stood by him through everything, who'd never given up on him. "You're right about that," Hank said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thanks, Ray, for everything. Anytime, brother. Anytime." The evening air was crisp as Hank pulled into Michelle's driveway. His motorcycle rumbled to a stop, and he could see her through the kitchen window, moving around inside. When she opened the front door, she was wearing an apron and holding a wooden spoon. "I hope you're hungry," she called out. "I'm making Mom's lasagna recipe." Hank's heart skipped a beat. Mary's lasagna had been legendary in their neighborhood. "You know how to make it?" "She taught me before." Michelle's voice caught for a moment. "Well, she made sure I knew all her recipes." Inside, the house smelled like tomatoes and herbs. The kitchen counter was covered in ingredients, and Michelle moved between them with practiced ease. Hank watched her work, seeing glimpses of Mary in the way she hummed while cooking, the way she tasted the sauce with the back of the spoon. "Want to help?" she asked, holding out an extra apron. Hank hesitated. "I might mess it up, Dad," Michelle said, and the words still felt new, precious. "You can't mess up grating cheese." They worked side by side, Hank carefully shredding mozzarella while Michelle layered the pasta. The kitchen radio played oldies, and occasionally one of them would hum along. It felt comfortable, natural, like they'd been doing this for years instead of months. "Remember what you told me when we first met?" Michelle asked, spreading ricotta over a layer of noodles. "At Mom's grave?" "I said a lot of things that day," Hank replied, his hands pausing over the cheese. "Most of them probably pretty stupid." Michelle shook her head. "You said you didn't know if you could be the father I needed, but you wanted to try." She looked up at him, her eyes bright. "You did more than try, Dad. You fought for me. You stood up against Tony, against your old life. You chose me." Hank had to look away, his vision blurring. "Your mother would have done the same. She did do the same, raising you alone." "She did," Michelle agreed, touching his arm. "And now I have both of you. Different ways, maybe, but I do." The timer dinged, and Michelle pulled the lasagna from the oven. The cheese was perfectly browned, bubbling at the edges. They sat at her small kitchen table, the legal papers from earlier pushed aside to make room for their plates. "To Mom," Michelle said, raising her glass of wine. "And to new beginnings." "To new beginnings," Hank echoed, clinking his glass against hers. The first bite took him back 25 years, sitting in their old kitchen with Mary. But this wasn't about the past anymore. This was about now, about the future, about the daughter across from him who had her mother's smile and her father's determination. "It's perfect," he said, and Michelle beamed. After dinner, they walked to the small park down the street. The spring evening was gentle, the trees swaying in a breeze. Michelle slipped her hand into Hank's as they followed the path around the pond. "I was thinking," she said, "maybe we could do Sunday dinners. Make it a regular thing." "Yeah." Hank squeezed her hand. "I'd like that. And maybe you could teach me to ride a motorcycle. A small one," she added quickly, seeing his expression. "Just for fun." Hank laughed. "Your mother would come back to haunt me." "Probably," Michelle grinned. "But she'd be happy too, seeing us together like this." They walked on, making plans for barbecues and holidays, for bike rides and cooking lessons. The path ahead was clear, and for the first time in years, Hank felt truly at peace. The neon sign of the Iron Horse Bar and Grill buzzed overhead as Hank parked his motorcycle. Michelle pulled up next to him in her car, smoothing her jacket nervously. "You sure about this?" she asked, eyeing the row of motorcycles lined up outside. Hank nodded, his beard twitching with a smile. "They're family, Michelle, and you're my daughter. It's time." Inside, the familiar smell of burgers and leather filled the air. The private room at the back was already crowded with members of Hank's motorcycle club. Ray was the first to spot them, his weathered face breaking into a broad grin. "Well, look who finally made it," Ray called out, walking over to give Hank a bear hug. He turned to Michelle, his expression softening. "And this must be the famous Michelle we've been hearing about." Michelle shook his offered hand. "Nice to meet you, Ray. Dad's told me a lot about you." "Dad, huh?" Ray's eyes crinkled at Hank. "That's new." The room grew quiet as other members noticed their arrival. Hank cleared his throat, placing a gentle hand on Michelle's shoulder. "Everyone, this is my daughter, Michelle." The silence lasted only a moment before the room erupted in warm greetings. Big Mike, a giant of a man with tattoos covering his arms, brought over 2 plates heaped with food. "Special of the house," he said with a wink. "Best burgers in town." As they settled into their seats, Michelle found herself surrounded by stories about her father. These weren't tales of wild rides or bar fights, but stories of loyalty, of Hank helping fellow riders through tough times, of his unwavering support for the club's charity runs. "Remember that time Hank spent 3 days fixing up old bikes for the children's home?" A woman named Sarah recalled, passing Michelle a basket of fries. "Wouldn't leave until every single one was running perfectly." Michelle glanced at her father, who was trying to hide his embarrassment behind his beer. She'd never seen this side of him before. Not just accepted, but truly respected and loved by this community. The evening flowed easily, with laughter and conversation filling the room. Michelle watched as her father relaxed, his usual guard dropping among these people who knew him so well. He seemed younger somehow, more at peace. Someone put on some music, and soon the room was filled with the sound of classic rock. Ray pulled out his phone and showed Michelle old photos of the club's charity events, including one of Hank dressed as Santa Claus for a toy drive. "He'll kill me for showing you that." Ray chuckled. "Worth it," Michelle grinned, saving the photo to her phone. As the night wore on, the crowd began to thin. Michelle found herself sitting with Hank at a quiet corner table, watching the last few members chat near the bar. The jukebox played softly in the background. "Thank you," she said, turning to her father, "for sharing this with me, for letting me see this part of your life." Hank's eyes were warm as he looked at his daughter. "These people, they've been my family for a long time. But having you here tonight," he paused, searching for the right words. "It feels like everything's finally complete, you know?" Michelle reached across the table and squeezed his hand. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last of the evening unfold, both marveling at how far they'd come from that first meeting at Mary's grave. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Pete's Diner as Hank waited for Michelle. He'd been coming here for their weekly breakfast meetings, a tradition they'd started after the family dinner at the Iron Horse. The bell above the door chimed, and he looked up, expecting to see his daughter. Instead, a familiar face from his past walked in. Tommy the Snake Martinez, a man Hank hadn't seen in 15 years, slid into the booth across from him. His silver hair was slicked back, and a gold chain glinted at his neck. "Long time no see, Angel," Tommy said, using Hank's old nickname. His voice was smooth as oil. Hank's jaw tightened. "What are you doing here, Tommy? Can't a guy catch up with an old friend?" Tommy's smile didn't reach his eyes. He pulled out an envelope and slid it across the table. "Got a business proposition for you. One last job. Big money, clean getaway. Just like old times." Hank stared at the envelope, but didn't touch it. "I'm not interested." "Come on, Hank. You're wasting your talents playing straight. The crew needs someone with your expertise." Tommy leaned forward, lowering his voice. "$500,000. You're cut. One night's work." Through the window, Hank saw Michelle's car pulling into the parking lot. His heart raced. "You need to leave. Now. Think about it," Tommy pressed. "You could set your girl up real nice with that kind of money. College fund, new house." I said no. Hank's voice was steel. The diner's bell chimed again as Michelle walked in. She spotted Hank and started toward their usual booth, then hesitated when she saw Tommy. "Dad?" she called out uncertainly. Tommy's eyebrows shot up. "Dad? Well, the angel's gone soft." Hank stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "We're done here, Tommy. Don't come around again." But Tommy wasn't finished. He turned to Michelle, who had reached their table. "Hey, sweetheart, did your old man ever tell you about the jobs we used to pull? The things he did?" Michelle's face paled. Hank stepped between them, his voice low and dangerous. "That's enough. Just think about it," Tommy said, standing up. He pulled a business card from his pocket and set on top of the envelope. "For old time's sake." After Tommy left, the diner seemed too quiet. Michelle slid into the booth, her eyes fixed on the envelope. "Who was that?" Hank sat down heavily, pushing the envelope away. "Someone I used to know. Someone I'm not proud of knowing." "What did he want?" "To pull me back into something I left behind a long time ago." Hank met his daughter's worried gaze. "But that's not who I am anymore. That life, it cost me everything that mattered. Your mother, you, my self-respect." Michelle reached across the table and picked up the envelope. Without opening it, she tore it in half, then in quarters. "I believe you, Dad." Hank watched as she dropped the pieces into her water glass, the paper beginning to dissolve. Relief and pride washed over him. "I'm sorry you had to see that. I've worked hard to change, to be someone worthy of being your father." "You are," Michelle said softly. "The man who used to run with people like that, he wouldn't have said no. He wouldn't be sitting here having breakfast with his daughter." The waitress approached with coffee, and Hank felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. He might have lost 15 years with his daughter, but he wasn't going to risk losing another minute. Not for all the money in the world. The Iron Horse Bar and Grill had been Hank's life for nearly 2 decades. The neon sign above the entrance buzzed softly in the early morning light as he unlocked the front door. Inside, the worn leather seats and scratched wooden tables told stories of countless nights filled with laughter, fights, and brotherhood. Ray stood beside him, his weathered face showing a mix of understanding and support. "You sure about this, brother?" Hank ran his hand along the polished bar counter. "Yeah, I am. Can't keep one foot in the past if I want to move forward." The realtor, Mrs. Thompson, arrived precisely at 9, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She carried a leather portfolio filled with papers and contracts. "Mr. Callahan, are you ready to proceed?" Hank nodded, leading them to a corner booth. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows, catching the framed photographs on the walls, snapshots of riders, bikes, and memories that spanned years. "The offer is quite generous," Mrs. Thompson said, spreading the documents across the table. "The developers are eager to close quickly." Ray leaned back, crossing his arms. "Place will probably be a coffee shop within a year." "Better that than what it could have been," Hank replied, thinking of Tommy's recent visit and the life he was leaving behind. He picked up the pen, his hand steady as he signed each page. The bell above the door chimed, and Michelle walked in. She'd taken the morning off work to be here for this moment. "Hey, Dad. All done." Hank signed the final page and handed it to Mrs. Thompson. "Just finished." Michelle sat next to him, placing her hand over his. "How do you feel?" "Like a time." He squeezed her hand. "Got the check from the sale of the bikes yesterday, too. Everything's going into that trust we talked about." Mrs. Thompson gathered the papers, tucking them into her portfolio. "Congratulations, Mr. Callahan. The funds will be transferred within 48 hours. After she left, Ray stood up. "Guess this called for one last drink." "Little early for that," Hank chuckled, but he went behind the bar anyway. He pulled out 3 coffee mugs and the old percolator that had seen them through countless morning after cleanups. Michelle watched him pour the coffee. "So what's next?" "Been thinking about that," Hank said, sliding the mugs across the bar. "Remember that old garage on Madison? Owner's looking to retire, willing to sell at a good price." "The auto shop?" Michelle's eyes lit up. "Dad, that's perfect. You've always been amazing with bikes. Cars wouldn't be that different." "Legitimate business," Ray nodded approvingly. "Good location, too." Hank took a sip of his coffee. "Thought maybe we could run it together. You got the business degree, I've got the mechanical know-how. If you're interested, that is." Michelle's smile widened. "Are you kidding? Of course I'm interested. We could start small, build it up." She paused, her expression softening. "Mom would have loved this, you know, seeing us work together." "Yeah," Hank said quietly. "She would have." Ray raised his mug. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," Hank and Michelle echoed, their coffee mugs clinking together in the morning light. Through the window, they could see the city coming to life. The past might have shaped them, but it didn't have to define their future. For the first time in years, Hank felt truly free. Not from obligations, but for possibilities. "What should we call it?" Michelle asked, already pulling out her phone to take notes. "Callahan and Daughter Auto Works," Hank suggested, watching his daughter's face light up at the word daughter. The morning air was crisp as Hank and Michelle walked through the cemetery gates. Autumn leaves crunched beneath their feet, creating a gentle rhythm that matched their steady pace. The sun had just begun to peek through the clouds, casting long shadows across the rows of headstones. Michelle carried a bouquet of white lilies, Mary's favorites. She'd remembered that detail from one of their many conversations over the past months, when Hank would share stories about her mother that she'd never known before. "Mom always said lilies reminded her of hope," Michelle said softly, adjusting the flowers in her arms. She'd buy them whenever she could afford to, even if it meant eating mac and cheese for dinner that week. Hank nodded, his throat tight. She kept a vase of them by the kitchen window, said they made the whole room brighter. They reached Mary's grave, where the morning dew still clung to the grass. The headstone, simple yet elegant, bore her name and the dates that marked her too short life. Michelle knelt down, carefully arranging the lilies against the stone. "I can't believe it's been 2 years," she murmured, running her fingers over the engraved letters of her mother's name. Hank stood beside her, his large frame casting a protective shadow. The leather of his jacket creaked as he shifted his weight, no longer the intimidating biker's armor it once was, but a comfortable reminder of who he'd been and who he'd become. "Your mother," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "She never gave up hope. Even when I was at my worst, even when I didn't deserve it." Michelle rose to stand beside him. "She kept every photo of you, you know, hidden in a box under her bed. I found them after." She paused, collecting herself. "I used to look at them sometimes, trying to imagine what you were like. And now," Hank asked, glancing at his daughter, "now I don't have to imagine anymore." Michelle smiled, though tears glistened in her eyes. "I just wish she could see us here together." A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and distant rain. Hank remembered the last time he'd stood here alone, drowning in grief and regret. Now, with Michelle beside him, the weight felt different, not gone, but shared, manageable. "She always wanted us to be a family," Hank said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Took me too long to understand what that meant." Michelle reached for his hand, her smaller fingers intertwining with his calloused ones. "But you figure it out eventually. That's what matters. They stood in comfortable silence, watching as the morning sun gradually warmed the cemetery. Other visitors began to arrive, paying their respects to their own loved ones, but Hank and Michelle remained focused on their private moment of remembrance. I talk to her sometimes, Michelle admitted. Tell her about my day, about us working on the garage together, about how you're teaching me to change oil and adjust timing belts. She'd be proud of you, Hank said, his voice thick with emotion. Of everything you've become. Of both of us, Michelle corrected gently. Of how far we've come. The sun finally broke through the clouds completely, bathing Mary's headstone in warm light. Hank placed his hand on Michelle's shoulder, a gesture that carried all the love and protection he'd failed to give her for so many years. In that touch was everything he struggled to say out loud. His pride, his gratitude, his unwavering commitment to being the father she deserved. After leaving the cemetery, Hank and Michelle drove to Parker's Point, a quiet overlook that provided a sweeping view of their small town below. The late morning sun bathed everything in a gentle golden light, making the autumn colors seem even more vibrant. They sat on a weathered wooden bench, the same one where Mary used to bring Michelle for picnics when she was little. Hank's motorcycle was parked nearby, its chrome catching the sunlight. It wasn't the same intimidating machine he'd ridden in his darker days. This one was newer, safer, meant for peaceful rides with his daughter rather than causing trouble. Your mother and I used to come up here, Hank said, his voice softer than usual. Back before everything went wrong. We'd watch the sunset and talk about our dreams. Michelle smiled, pulling her jacket closer against the cool breeze. She never told me that. What kind of dreams? Simple ones. Hank's weathered face creased with a gentle smile. A house with a white picket fence, Sunday dinners together, maybe a dog. He paused, his eyes distant. I was too young, too restless to appreciate what I had. Always chasing something bigger, something more exciting. And now? Michelle asked, studying her father's profile. Hank turned to look at her, his eyes clear and steady. Now I know the biggest things in life are the ones right in front of you. Family, love, second chances. Below them, the town was coming to life. Cars moved along the streets like tiny toys, and the church bells chimed the hour. The garage they'd been working on together was visible from here, a small building that represented their shared future. You know, Michelle said, when I first found you at Mom's grave, I never thought we'd end up here. I was so angry, so hurt. You had every right to be, Hank acknowledged. His hands, once used for fighting, now rested peacefully in his lap. I spent so many years running from who I was, who I could be. But your mother never lost faith in me, and somehow, neither did you. A red-tailed hawk soared overhead, riding the thermal currents with effortless grace. Michelle watched it circle, remembering how her mother used to say that hawks were messengers of change. The past few months haven't been easy, she said, but they've been worth it. Every difficult conversation, every awkward moment, every step forward. Hank nodded, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over him. The weight of his past mistakes, while not forgotten, no longer pressed down on him with crushing force. Instead, they served as reminders of how far he'd come, of the man he'd chosen to become. You know what Ray told me the other day? Hank said, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He said he always knew I had it in me to turn things around. Said he could see it, even when I couldn't see it myself. Michelle reached over and squeezed his hand. He was right. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the town below. The morning sun continued its climb, warming their faces and casting long shadows behind the bench. After a while, Hank stood up, his joints creaking slightly. Ready to head back? He asked, offering his hand to help Michelle up. We've got that transmission to finish at the garage. Michelle took his hand and stood, brushing off her jeans. Lead the way, Dad. Together, they walked toward the parking lot, their footsteps in sync. The town spread out below them, familiar yet somehow new, full of possibilities they were ready to explore together. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.